So I'm here today to give you a bit of a status update, I suppose, of you know, not only arrivals via the Mediterranean, but also what's happening on the other side of, you know, the shores. So talking about North Africa and Turkey, and of course, as much as we know about flows within Europe. One thing I want to sort of emphasize throughout this presentation is that because the format of migration that I'll be talking about is irregular, that this means that data is very incomplete and often quite difficult to sort of say with certainty what is actually happening. I'm going to be giving you sort of a heavily caveated overview of what we do know about irregular migration in the European context. So as you can see here, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of my project, just because these caveats I think are especially important when you're talking about migrant deaths and disappearances. And then I'm going to speak about the 3 different trans-Mediterranean routes, as well as overland routes into Europe, which I think don't get spoken about much. I'm going to briefly discuss migration within Europe, and then sort of talk about what's missing, what's happening outside of the European context, what happens. You know, many of these migrants are not just coming from Libya themselves or, you know, Turkey themselves. They travel quite some time before they actually reach Europe. So my project, the Missing Migrants project, is currently the only global database on migrant deaths and disappearances. Of course, there are several other organizations which collect this data in the Mediterranean and European context, notably the UNHCR. So we compile data on age, gender, country of origin, location, and cause of death of migrants, and we provide analysis in various different formats. And actually, one thing I want to highlight, because I know quite a lot of you are students or looking to get into the field of migration, is that our data is fully transparent. I mean, it's anonymized, but it is fully available for download on our website if you're ever interested in doing some more sort of like analysis for yourself. So our methodology is quite unique. It's actually very necessarily ad hoc. Because there are very, very, very few sources of official data on migrant deaths. You can imagine this is quite a controversial topic, and so generally states, governments will not actually identify who is or is not a migrant in their mortality statistics. So we collect data from 4 main sources. It really depends on what region of the world we're talking about, how much we use from each source, but this is official reporting, so government data. IOM reporting. IOM is an organization of 11,000 people with offices in most countries of the world, and so we do rely quite heavily on our country offices to send us information when they come across it on migrant deaths. We also collaborate with quite a lot of NGOs and other UN agencies, and of course media sources. We are, you know, very dependent on keyword searches, and we're developing some machine learning tools to give us results on these, you know, reports, because very often in many regions of the world, media sources are really the only source of information on migrant deaths. These are all verified by our team at GMDAG, the Global Migration Data Analysis Center, and then are entered into the Missing Migrants Project database. It's updated twice a week, so it's always very timely data. So I'm not going to go into this deeply. It's like you can talk about this for, you know, a month really, but because of course the vast majority of people in our database are irregular migrants, this means that they're often choosing routes to escape detection, which means that very often bodies are not found for weeks or sometimes at all. We know in you know, migration over water, such as the Mediterranean, people can disappear without a trace. We quite often, where there are official statistics, they are heavily aggregated, and so it's quite difficult to know specifically who died during migration, whereas who was sort of living in the country for several years. And then, of course, the huge amount of incomplete information. Like I said, there's no official complete data on this means that it's quite likely, we always say our data is a minimum estimate, because it's very likely that in the Mediterranean, but also the rest of the world, that we are undercounting the true number of deaths. I'm just briefly going to talk about the Mediterranean. So there is no real forensic data on deaths in the Mediterranean currently available, or at least publicly available. This, of course, means that not only are people dying, but also that their families often don't know what has happened to them. We receive a handful of requests every week from families who are searching for lost loved ones who have disappeared in the Mediterranean or European context, and there are no international structures in place really to deal with this huge issue of identification of missing migrants. One area that is extremely concerning is the central Mediterranean. It's a much it's the longest route across the Mediterranean, and we have recorded hundreds of bodies washing up in Libya and Tunisia over the last few years that are not sort of associated with any larger shipwreck happening nearby, which of course indicates that we are missing shipwrecks. People are dying that we don't know about at all, and so it's thought that many people are missing in addition to the bodies that are sort of confirmed. So Fatalities data. So this is a screenshot from our database. We have recorded more than 17,000 deaths just in the Mediterranean between 2014, when our project started, through, I think this is through Monday's data. You can see here visually that there are sort of 3 routes. So you can see between Turkey and the Greek islands, it's very close to the Turkish border. There were quite a lot of deaths there, of course, when there was this huge spike in 2015 and early 2016. The central Mediterranean, which, as I mentioned, is by far the deadliest route, and I'll get into that in just a moment, and the western Mediterranean, which is largely between Morocco and Spain, but also increasingly we see Algeria, migrants leaving from Algeria. This is just a chart that you may have seen before or something similar. So this is the number of deaths that we've recorded since 2014. Before that, this is based on the Migrants files, which is another database that's no longer in operation, as well as compared to the arrivals, irregular arrivals in Europe via the Mediterranean. So you can see quite clearly there was a huge peak in 2015 when we saw nearly 1 million migrants cross from Turkey. And that has since decreased dramatically. This year, we're really on track to go back to the number of arrivals seen prior to 2014, when sort of this increase began. Of course, this is not the full picture, right? Arrivals in Europe does not represent, the number of people who actually try to cross. We increasingly see that migrants are intercepted by coast guards in North Africa and Turkey and returned there. Of course, we know that situation for migrants in these countries is not as good as it is in Europe, though of course there are problems in Europe. There are not the egregious human rights violations that we see in these other countries. And so what I'm going to try to highlight throughout this presentation is attempted crossings. The data is highly incomplete. But it's important to understand that when we're talking about things like deaths, that you need to consider the whole picture, not just the European context. This is the data we have available on attempted migrant crossings. And so you can sort of see the shift in the number of interceptions. So 2018 is incomplete data, it's only through July, but you can see there's been an increasing number of interceptions by non-European authorities, and of course these people are not brought to Europe. The problem with this, of course, is that we only have data on this for Libya, Tunisia to some degree, and Turkey, which means, of course, that there are actually many more people intercepted by North African authorities in particular than is shown here. So this is a kind of an overwhelming chart at a glance, but I wanted to first highlight that 88% of the deaths recorded in our database occur in the central Mediterranean. In 2017 alone, this was 93%. So overwhelmingly, the humanitarian crisis is happening in the central Mediterranean. So this is again where we see lots of bodies being found washed up that are not associated with larger shipwrecks, which means that there are probably more people actually dying than we do know about. 326 just last year. And there has been this year, since February last year, but really we started seeing this trend since sort of the summer last year. The Italian government signed a memorandum of understanding with the Libyan National Reconciliation Government, and since then we've seen a very dramatic drop in flows across the central Mediterranean. One thing I wanted to highlight, and this is this chart, which is a sneak peek from an upcoming report that will be published in about 2 weeks' time, is to highlight how you can see here, I don't know, I can't really move the mouse, but this blue represents interceptions by European authorities, and you can see that that's actually gone down fairly dramatically over time. So the Western Mediterranean is another route, and it's one I in particular want to highlight because this is now the main trans-Mediterranean route this year. It's now surpassed the number of arrivals in Italy, or the number of arrivals in Spain has now surpassed the number of arrivals in Italy. But more concerningly, as you can see here, far more migrants are dying on this route than previous year. You know, you consider that it's only July and we've already passed the total number of deaths recorded in any year since 2014. Of course, this is extremely concerning. This is also a route which has, existed for quite some time. Actually, a lot of migrants will cross via boat or via land into the Spanish enclaves of Melilla and Ceuta. It's always been used, or at least since like the mid-1900s, but only in the early 2000s when border controls really tightened did we start to see this number of deaths happening. So in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean, I think this is really the focus of this conference. It seems like we are in Germany, and of course the majority of the migrants who are largely asylum seekers came via the Eastern Mediterranean, mostly from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan in winter 2015 to March 2016. Of course, you can see very visually there's a huge number of arrivals or attempted crossings in 2015, but this very dramatically dropped off after the EU-Turkey statement was signed in March 2016. So this is a route that's actually more likely to be used by women and children, and so 1 in 3 of the recorded fatalities in our database on this route are children, which is extremely tragic. So overland routes in Europe. I think this is something that people really don't seem to talk about for some reason. I think it's just because it's less easily detectable. This is just my thought. Because tracing irregular migration on overland routes is so much more difficult to actually see, right? It's not a boat arriving in an island that's very visible. It's people traveling in ones and twos in small groups across borders trying to escape detection, which of course makes it extremely difficult to generate a complete picture of how this is actually happening. So basically we don't really know the true number of people that are crossing irregularly on overland routes into Europe. The best sort of data that we have to approximate this is apprehensions data. Yes, and there is also this issue that I just wanted to raise. Of course, irregular migration is often thought of like people, it's almost like this invasion narrative, right? These people are coming, but actually the majority of irregular migrants in Europe actually are just people who have overstayed their visas. So just a thing to consider. So this is routes from Turkey. So it is Greece, arrivals in Greece and Bulgaria from Turkey. You can see quite visually that Bulgaria used to be sort of the main route, and now it's shifted to Greece. Actually, surprisingly, the number of irregular arrivals in Greece this year make up the majority of all irregular arrivals in Europe. I think the focus, the media focus has been very much on the central Mediterranean, but actually this year, most people are arriving in Greece. Irregular, this is just a more complete picture, so including these land arrivals, you can see very dramatically that even though this sort of narrative of, oh gosh, the migration crisis has, this is still ongoing, you can see very dramatically here that the number of irregular arrivals has dropped off by a huge amount. And then one last thing to sort of discuss is migration within Europe. This has the same sort of challenges as overland migration to Europe, actually even more so, because most of the data on these last slides is from IOM's displacement tracking matrix, which is a project where states basically decide we want to know about migration flows or some sort of like migration related activity in a certain issue in a certain area, and so there's quite good monitoring in the Western Balkans. But throughout most of Europe, we don't actually have a good idea of the flows. And of course, in the Western Balkans, if you have, a registry in each country of the, Western Balkans route, right, which is from Greece, sort of like north. This is how many migrants actually arrived in Germany in 2015 and 2016. You run the risk of counting the same person twice, right? So this data is, you can't just add them all together and say this is how many migrants have gone on this route. So that's why I'm using the deaths data, because of course you can't double count a death because a body is a body. Sort of a route that was used more so in the past is Calais, France to the UK. We recorded 68 deaths on this route since the project started in 2014. This is a migrant camp in northern France that is used, basically migrants would stay there and then attempt to reach the UK via the Eurotunnel, usually by hopping on the back of a truck or similar. The camp was actually closed by French authorities in October 2016. The number of deaths have dropped off dramatically since, and presumably the flows have as well, though again, we really don't know because it's a very poorly monitored route. The Western Balkans route is still very much in use. We have 135 deaths recorded on this route. One area of concern is the Evros River between Turkey and Greece, where we've recorded a pretty dramatic increase in deaths in just the last year. Again, this is linked to the increasing number of flows via overland to Greece. This route, I think, has been increasingly sort of militarized and blocked off, because of the huge spike in 2015, 2016, and so the number of arrivals recorded by this displacement tracking matrix decreased by 80% between 2015 and 2016, which is very dramatic. So you can see, 2014 there were very few deaths. I think this increased dramatically in, small numbers, but it did increase over time, and especially in 2016 when we saw these border controls put in place, the number of deaths doubled. Ventimiglia is the route that we're now seeing is sort of most active. This is a route from Italy to France, often by a train. They'll hop on trains, and unfortunately we have recorded 28 deaths, mostly due to electrocution on a train or falling off, or some, these really horrible sort of transit-related deaths. This is particularly concerning because it doesn't seem to really be talked about much in the media, even though there are, sort of operationally we know that quite a lot of irregular migrants are going this way. There were no deaths recorded prior to September 2016. So of course, whenever we see a route where we see an increase in deaths, we assume that our data is highly incomplete. So this is, of course, an area of concern. So what's missing? I think quite often the narrative of irregular migration does become this sort of invasion narrative, right? And you can see here very clearly that between 2014 to 2016, the number of irregular migrants actually made up a very small proportion of the overall migration flows to Europe. Especially, unfortunately, there's no data on regular flows available for 2016 or 2017, but you would see, you can see here in this sort of bar chart that overwhelmingly 2015 made up the largest proportion, and actually now, 2016 was already back dramatically, and now it would be more like, I would imagine, less than 5% of the overall migration flow. So when Mr. Donfried said, we've bitten off more than we can chew, I actually strongly disagree, because Europe welcomes many millions of migrants every year, and that's certainly not something that is insurmountable. So one sort of final thought is, again, on this sort of wider context, is how scarce data on migratory routes outside of Europe is. Again, there's this displacement tracking matrix that IOM runs that has some flow monitoring points in sort of West Africa, North Africa, as well as Turkey. But again, because it's much harder to detect overland flows, especially you think about areas like the Sahara, which are extremely vast, having one or two flow monitoring points is just like, there's no way that that's capturing the full picture, right? And I think a really important thing to consider is how data drives sort of media or policy narratives, right? So one thing we always think about is IOM produces data like on a weekly basis about irregular arrivals and deaths, which is useful, of course, but it also does may to some degree, encourage this narrative, this focus on just Europe and like a lack of sort of a wider context. And so for our data set, the Missing Migrants Project, data on fatalities is extremely, extremely scarce. We rely on media reports, which again are really scarce, surveys, which we get only sort of at the end of the year every year. So I had a journalist asking me a few days ago, oh, why have the number of deaths in the Sahara dropped off so much? It's not that they've dropped off, it's that the data is just so incomplete. Two specific areas of concern on routes to Europe, but prior to European borders, are the Syria-Turkey border. Human Rights Watch and a few other NGOs have recorded more than 150 shootings on that border since 2016. And then possibly of greatest concern is the Sahara. Anecdotal reports from our sort of operational team working with migrants in the Libyan and Nigerian context indicate that the Sahara is extremely deadly. Other experts have estimated that it's at least as many as the Mediterranean. I've also heard people say up to 10 times as many, because it really is this area. You can see, actually, this picture is a truck full carrying migrants across the Sahara. So you can see that they're crammed into these trucks by smugglers. And anecdotally, the migrants who survive this trip report there's often insufficient food, water. If a migrant becomes ill or just falls off by chance, they're just left behind. IOM has a new program that's actually starting search and rescue in the Sahara Desert, and there have been a couple of times where they have found piles of bodies in the desert, which is, of course, absolutely terrifying when you consider how vast this area is, and realistically what we're doing is, a drop in the bucket. So just a final thought. You can see here what our data looks like worldwide. So it is overwhelmingly dominated by deaths in the Mediterranean, but like I said, monitoring in other regions is just so difficult. And in particular, you can see the Sahara, just based on surveys of a couple hundred to 1,000 migrants every year, results in more than 1,000 deaths. This is, of course, extremely concerning when you consider that there are hundreds of thousands of migrants transiting through this region every year. Again, I want to sort of problematize this narrative of crisis, because I think as soon as you make something a crisis, it means that there's a lot of attention on it, you produce data on it, and it sort of like becomes this feedback loop. And so, while absolutely I consider the Mediterranean to be a crisis, a humanitarian crisis, though not so much a migration crisis at this point, migrant deaths are occurring worldwide. It's just a question of whether or not they are sort of publicized and acknowledged. Yeah, that's it. If you have any quick questions. Do we have time for questions? I can't actually see a clock. Or
I think we're like limited of time, but if there's some interesting questions, maybe let's take the chance.
yes, please.
I have a question. I was interested, like what ways, how do you gather the data? Because I'm assuming it's very hard to do that, as you also mentioned, like in many cases. So if you could maybe like help us a little with that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it varies greatly from region to region. I guess I can say in the Mediterranean context, IOM actually has operations like on the ground receiving migrants and providing assistance at almost every landing point in Italy, Greece, Turkey, Libya, and Spain. And so we get information from them, and basically what happens is they will, while they're providing assistance, they basically ask them, is anyone missing? Did you see anyone die? And from that we sort of get a sense, of course immediately know like if someone has died concretely, but in cases where there are large shipwrecks, this is a bit more complicated, right? Because if there's hundreds of people on board and only 20 people survive, it's not like there's an official list of names on these smuggling boats. So what we do is interview migrants to get an estimate of the total number of people on board. This usually results in sort of like a range. So it'll say, we'll end up saying, okay, there were between 200 and 300 people. We always use the most conservative estimate because we do just say that our data is a minimum estimate, and then we subtract the number of survivors and bodies recovered to get an estimate of the number of sort of like missing and lost at sea. This is, it is very much an estimate, but because UNHCR is also collecting data and uses the same methodology, we coordinate with them to make sure that we are getting something that's wildly different, because of course that would then flag that there's some sort of like information issue there. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you could, if you knew, if you could speak to the relationship between when the EU sends millions of dollars to like Turkey or Libya to restrict the mobility of people, and its relationship to rates of fatality. This idea of a fatality rate is something that I really want to problematize, because like I said, we don't know how many people are actually trying to cross, and our data is very much a minimum estimate, and so it's really, I can't really say that we've seen like a concrete increase or decrease, because it's not a mortality rate. A mortality rate is something that's like requires very rigorous data, and that just doesn't exist in the case of the Mediterranean. I'm sorry, it's not a very satisfying answer. Yes.
I also want to ask, does IOM or do you know of any international organization that is working on like the victims of the missing migrants, their families? Does IOM do anything after finding the missing migrants?
So this is something that we're starting research on at the moment, but currently really the only program
that does this is the International Red Cross. They have a program called Restoring Family Links that works on just, it's like very general, but they increasingly are seeing that, you know, families of missing migrants are using this service, and I believe just this year they've started sort of like a operational refocusing and sort of trying to address this issue. I think historically that program has been more in situations of conflict, and so while it's still difficult, it's more sort of like people in one country looking for people in the same country. Whereas, of course, when you're talking about international migration, it becomes a lot more complicated. There are so many different languages, there are so many different places this person could be, and it's a really huge challenge to address. I think there's this Global Compact for Migration. The draft was just finalized. It should be signed in December, and Objective 8 of this Global Compact for Migration focuses on saving lives and establishing transnational cooperation, and specifically on this issue of identification. I think especially in the Mediterranean context, but also in areas like the US-Mexico border, this is a really huge issue, and it's very, very difficult to solve. Yes?
Thank you for your presentation. You emphasize the fact that the migration on the west route is increasing now.
Mm-hmm.
Spain are welcoming more migrants than Italy. How can you explain that?
I mean, I think it's hard to say, right? You don't know if these are like the same migrants who would have originally gone via the central Mediterranean. It's like, so it's a little bit hard, like understanding how migrants gain information and make decisions is very complicated, but my guess is, so historically Libya was actually a destination country in and of itself. It was relatively wealthy, and migrants from sub-Saharan Africa would go there to work. Of course, since 2014, there was a huge, it became extremely unstable, very dangerous for migrants. There's a sort of a rise in xenophobia. You may have read about these slave markets that are sort of reported to be existing. And it may be that migrants are hearing about this and deciding to go somewhere else. It's really hard to say exactly why this is happening, because of course, while situations are awful in Libya, it's not always clear that migrants in countries of origin know that that's the case. So it's a little bit hard to say why this is happening, but yeah, especially because we don't have data on interceptions by Moroccan authorities, it's really hard to get a real complete idea of the attempted crossings on that route, and so it may be that this increase is even higher. We just don't really know about the flows because the data is so incomplete. Yes?
I was wondering if there's any feedback of the data and locations that you're collecting on the ships missions that are currently done in the Mediterranean, like the Lifeline mission, where ships or private vessels are going out to rescue migrants, and obviously this map that you showed earlier is probably quite powerful in that work. Yeah,
I mean, I have to say that this map with the dots, it's approximate. We're actually not allowed to give the precise location of shipwrecks for security reasons. But I mean, we are in contact with many NGOs. I think sort of like anecdotally, the people I've talked to have said shipwrecks are increasingly happening closer to Libyan shores in the central Mediterranean. Just so you guys know, so quite often in the central Mediterranean, migrants are put onto a ship that only has enough gas to just get them into international waters, and not enough to actually make the entire crossing, which takes several days. And so this is really why you see so many shipwrecks in this route. I'm sorry, we can talk during the break, but I think we're a little over time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.